everyone. I'm Antoinette Rangel, class of 2009 and one of the New York City chapter volunteers. We are so excited to host this first edition of Middlebury Wine School. It's very timely themed to kick off summer with a focus on rosé. This pandemic has certainly been a challenging time, and it's great to connect with Middlebury alumni, even if it's in a virtual space. Before I introduce our fabulous host for this evening, I just wanted to go over some housekeeping items. This is a Zoom meeting, so you can turn on your camera and see all the other participants who do so as well. There are quite a few of us here, so if you're a little bit unfamiliar with Zoom, on the upper right-hand corner, you can do the gallery view and scroll through the different pages to see your friends and classmates. We're trying out this format because we thought it'd be nice to see each other as we enjoy wine together. We're gonna mute all participants during the chat, but you can use the chat feature to ask us any questions, and I'm going to monitor that throughout and ask Yassi throughout the evening. So we really encourage your participation. We want to hear what you guys want to ask. So for the next 45 minutes, all you need is yourself to relax and enjoy some rosé. And with that, I'll introduce you to my fellow 2009 classmate, Yassmin Dever. Yassi's been at Sotheby's for about 4 years now. She focuses on wine advisory, helping clients build, refine, and manage their wine collections. And we want to thank Yassi for hosting the first edition of Middlebury Wine School. The response was overwhelming, and we're really grateful that you're taking time out of your busy schedule to do this for Middlebury. So with that, I'll turn it over to Yassi.
Great, thank you, Antoinette, for that lovely introduction. And thank you, I'm so glad Middlebury organized this. And this was kind of the inaugural tasting, so very curious. At the end of it, would love to get feedback because we'd like to continue doing these series. But I'll give a quick introduction to start. My name's Yassi. Like Antoinette mentioned, I've been at Sotheby's for about 4 years now, working in their wine department. Specifically, I've been working in their advisory team, so working with clients who want to start a new wine collection, or working with clients who have established wine collections that they need help managing. But I didn't actually get my start in wine. I started in finance. I spent about 6 years at Citi and realized that my passion was wine and decided to take a risk. So I made a big career change, and I've been at Sotheby's for about 4 years now. And now it's my job to be able to drink wine with you guys. So nice perks of the job, certainly. I think my husband's gonna walk in and see this and be like, this is work. So anyway, with that, today we're gonna be talking about rosé. I thought that would be an appropriate topic to kick off the summer. Everyone likes to drink rosé, but now hopefully my goal is to at least equip you guys with a few pearls of knowledge that you can drop at your next barbecue where you're sipping on rosé. So with that, before I kick off, I always like to say this whenever I conduct tastings, but I feel like wine is a very daunting, scary topic for a lot of people. And my goal really is to make wine as approachable as possible. And there's really no dumb questions. So truly feel free to use me as a resource. You're in my nest for the next 45 or so minutes. If you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. Antoinette's gonna keep an eye on it. And if you're too afraid to ask in the chat, feel free to reach out to me. I was gonna say, you can follow at Sotheby's Wine if you wanna hear about any kind of upcoming auctions or events. And my handle on Instagram is Eat Drink Yas, Y-A-S. So if you have any questions you didn't wanna ask in the chat, you're too afraid to, feel free to send direct message as well. So with that, let's kick it off and let's start talking about rosé. And by the way, as I'm kind of going through some of the information, the point of this is really to be fun. Feel free to, I hope you have a glass of rosé poured, and even if you weren't able to buy any of the ones that I'm tasting today, make sure you have something in your glass to drink. And I'll kind of spend some time talking about rosé in general, but then at the end of it, I'll walk you through what some of these. I've selected 3 of my favorite wines, 1 bonus wine I'll talk about. But just if you are drinking all of them, hopefully it's a good Thursday night for you guys. I would suggest drinking them in this order. The first one is the Chateau Parasol from Provence. The second is the Sotheby's Sancerre, and the third is the Bedrock Ode to Lulu, which is from California. And I'll explain a little later why I would suggest them in that order. But with no further ado, I'll kick it off. And so I guess big picture, first thing I want to talk about is what is rosé, how is it made, and why is it pink? So there's a couple different ways to make rosé. The first major way to make rosé is the direct press method. So basically what that means is, first of all, the grapes that go in to make the rosé are destined to be rosé. And I'll explain how that's differentiated from another kind, which will follow. But basically, what makes rosé and what makes wine pink is that you're macerating the skins of the grape with the juice for a limited amount of time. So we'll take a step back and rewind. With red wine, the reason why red wine is red is because you're allowing the skins of the grape to remain in contact with the juice and macerate. And so what happens is that juice soaks up and extracts the color, among a few other things, from the wine. And so with rosé, instead of with like red wine, you may allow this maceration to take place over a period of weeks. With rosé, you just allow a very limited amount of time of maceration. So a couple hours instead of a couple weeks. And I would I would liken it to, I think it helps make it understandable. If you think about it like a tea bag that you steep, right? The longer you steep the tea bag, the more the color it's going to extract from the tea, and the darker the tea will be. It's a very similar concept. So the less time that it spends on the skins, the more pale the rosé will be. And you'll notice, just like between these rosés that I have here, I have these glasses kind of hiding behind, but the darker the rosé, that what it means is it's been, there's more color extraction. It's probably been sitting on the skins for longer. So that's one way, the direct press method. And most rosés are made in that way. The second way is called the saignée method. It's a little more controversial, but basically with the saignée method, certain producers are making red wines that they want to be really big, bold, and concentrated. And so what they'll do sometimes is as the grape skins are macerating with the juice, they'll actually run off some of the juice. And what that does is it makes the ratio of skins to juice greater, so that there'll be more concentration, more extraction, more kind of a bigger, bolder red wine, if you will. And what they'll do is that runoff they'll use to make rosé. And so the reason why I say and just those in general, rosés made in that saignée type method tend to be bigger, bolder, slightly lower acidity. The reason why I say it's controversial is because when you think about it, the grapes that were harvested to produce red wine are kind of different. You would harvest under different criteria than you would if you were to make rosé, because what happens is for red wine, generally you'll pick the grapes a little bit later, and so therefore the wines tend to have slightly lower acidity. So the idea is with the direct press method, which is the first one that I described, the grapes are picked to make rosé. They're harvested at just the right time to achieve the exact objective you would want in a rosé, with a lot of freshness and brightness and zippy, zesty acidity. Whereas with saignée method, the reason why it's contentious is because their grapes were picked for red wine and you're making rosé out of it. Now, I mean, I'm speaking in generalizations. That I've had rosés made in saignée method that are wonderful, but it's just generally more. Most of the rosés we taste are made from the direct press method. And then there's a third, which is just very uncommon, but you can also actually blend red wine with white wine. It tends to not be associated with higher quality rosés, except with the exception of in champagne. They do that for rosé champagne, but generally speaking, tends to be one of the two first methods that I described. So if I could leave you with like one pearl for you to walk away with of all the information I'm giving you, is like rosé is made by basically macerating the juice with the skins for less amount of time than you would with the red wine, and that's how you end up with a lighter colored wine. So with that, I guess I'll talk about, where is rosé made generally, and kind of what are the different styles, and how do you figure out which rosé you should try based on your preferences. So in terms of, rosé is made all over the world, anywhere where red wine is made. Provence is really like the soul, the heartland of rosé. I think it's about 50% of production is rosé. Provence, and I think they've been the most successful in terms of marketing their rosé. Probably when we think about rosé, we think about Provençal rosé. That's what we see on the shelves a lot. And why is it so popular? I think, like I said, I think they've done a really great job of like marketing themselves. They've really specialized in rosé. And I don't know, for me, what I find with Provence is a really unique, I love Provence because it's a really, if anyone knows where Provence is or has had the good fortune to visit, it's in a pretty sunny, warm place. It's one of the sunniest regions in France, in the very southern part of France, near the Mediterranean Sea. And because it's really close to the Mediterranean Sea, it also, it has a cooling factor. So you have the warmth and you have the sun, which allows the grapes to ripen. But at the same time, there's this cooling effect from the sea, which allows them to retain acidity. And when we talk about quality wine, it's all about balance. So that's the beauty of why Provence is so great for rosé and for winemaking is you get that ripeness of the grapes, but you also get to keep the acidity in the wine and that freshness, which is so essential for rosé. So Provence is kind of the most well-known region for rosé, but I'm trying to think about how to break it down in a way that's easier to digest and how I think about what types of rosés you might favor based on your taste, like whether you like a lighter, fresher, dry style of rosé versus like a more medium-bodied, bold rosé. It often tends to depend on the type of grape that's used. So like a lighter, drier rosé, I would gravitate towards regions, well, I think about it like what grapes are a little bit lighter. So Pinot Noir is a good example, Cabernet Franc and the Loire. So in terms of regions, there's great wines. I would lean towards Provence, towards Loire. If you want a type of rosé that's a little bit more light, fresh, zippy. Whereas if the type of wine that you gravitate towards is a little bigger and bolder and you want a bolder rosé, I would gravitate towards regions like Rioja. So Tempranillo is the grape they make in Rioja, and it tends to be a bigger, bolder grape. So the rosé tends to be also a little bigger and bolder. Rioja, Navarra, in southern France, there's certain regions like Tavel. So for a bigger, bolder style, I would lean towards rosé made from bigger, bolder grapes, which kind of intuitively makes sense. And then there's actually also a type of rosé that is made from, it's a type of rosé that's kind of been trending out, but I'm sure a lot of people, especially if you're of the wine drinking age around the 90s, are familiar with, which is Blush, White Zinfandel from California that became extremely popular in the 90s and was this kind of really kind of sweet, slightly cloyingly sweet style of rosé. And this, I think in some ways what happened, I think right now today, rosé is so popular, it's hard to think of a time when it wasn't, at least for me. But yeah, I think in the 90s and people just associated rosé with this really sweet style. The pendulum has definitely been kind of swinging the other way towards a more dry, refreshing style. I say starting like around the 2000s. And what's really interesting is like, it was very rare before to see a winemaker who would go out of his way to make a rosé for the sake of making a rosé. Whereas now it's very common now to see it on restaurant wine lists. And you're seeing like more of a shift where people are I think not only are people favoring drier, more refreshing styles, but they're also, I find consumers asking and caring more about like where the rosés are coming from. So there's this idea of terroir coming into play, whereas before it was never really even a question when it came to rosé. And what I mean by terroir, which is like a word dropped a lot by wine people, and I think it's kind of confusing for a lot of people. And what I mean by terroir is really just like the idea that there is this really unique sense of place for a specific vineyard site that gives it a really unique personality. So the idea is, I always like to talk about this experience that I had where for me, the idea of terroir, I had this like aha moment where there's a wine bar that I really loved in New York City that I went to, and they did a flight of wines where they were they were pouring wines from the same producer, from the same vintage, same grape, just from different regions, and from different vineyard sites. Sorry, same region, just literally vineyard sites like a stone's throw apart from one another, and they tasted different. And so that's this idea that like all these little nuances about a specific site, like what angle they're facing the sun, the exposure, which part of the slope they're on. Are they on the steeper part of the slope, or are they on the part at the bottom where there's more water that accumulates? All these, does this side face the wind a little more? There's like all these little nuances that define one certain place and actually do shockingly reflect themselves in the wine. So I think one thing that's super interesting about Rosé and kind of how Rosé is changing and how the perception of Rosé is changing is I think consumers and like the market in general is becoming more aware of Rosé as a serious wine category and not just as like, something you sip at like at the beach club. So I think it's really interesting, Rosé as a category in general and how it's been evolving. And I think it's great because there's a lot of people out there and producers who are really putting a lot of work into making a great Rosé. And I hope that like the perception that Rosé is this like, girls drink Rosé and it's this very kind of not serious, it's starting to change, which is kind of exciting to me because there's a lot of really exciting wines that should get the attention. So anyway, that's just a little bit about trends and like what's going on. Before I move on, are there any questions that maybe you wanna ask?
Yeah, definitely. So since this is largely a New York crowd, people are wondering which wine bar that was.
Oh yes, so Aldesam Wine Bar. It's on. It's the wine bar from the same beverage director, Aldesam, Le Bernardin. It's in Midtown, and actually, the way I ended up there is because I had like client meetings in Midtown one time, and I just like wandered in there. And if you're a wine lover, it was definitely like where I got my start in wine, in terms of my love for wine.
And then others were asking if you have recommendations on Spanish rosé.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most incredible, like age-worthy examples is Lopez de Heredia. And it's kind of a rare, an exception, I guess, because most rosés are really meant to be drank young, and they're really like, they're meant to be drank young, they're fresh, they're kind of easy drinking. But there are a number of really, really serious producers putting out age-worthy examples of rosé, which I think for most people to think of like aging a rosé would be very shocking. Like it's something we all associate with drinking immediately. And I'm not saying we shouldn't. For most rosés, we should. What makes a rosé, and in my opinion, what makes it so enjoyable is that really fresh, fruity, that freshness. And I think, and as you age a wine, it tends to lose a little bit of that in certain cases if it wasn't meant for aging. But in certain cases with certain producers like Lopez de Heredia, like de Mentempierre, which is another one I have here as the bonus one I'll talk about afterwards. They're making these incredible wines that actually have bottle age. And in the case of Lopez de Heredia, they are seeing aging in oak barrels. So anyway, that was just one from Spain that I thought of, that was like a really special example. But what I would be happy to do is if anyone has any specific questions about recommendations from certain regions that I've mentioned, feel free to send me a direct message on Instagram. I'm happy to give you guys recommendations as well.
And then another question about the color, whether it impacts sweetness and also is like darker related with greater health benefits. We obviously all want more excuses to drink wine.
Sure. I mean, the amount of like, so in terms of health benefits, people talk about health benefits of red wine because of the anthocyanins that are in the skins. So logic would dictate that the more extraction you have, the more of these components that are healthful will be extracted. But with rosé, unfortunately, I mean, I can't go deep into the science accurately, at least, but there's such limited, it's still relatively limited in terms of the time that you're extracting these components from the skins. I would liken probably rosé more to white than red in terms of the like antioxidants that you're getting from the skins. But don't let that deter you. Do we need an excuse to drink rosé or white wine? No, I certainly don't.
Yeah. The wines that you recommended, I noticed some are corked and then others are screw top. Can you sort of talk about like the differences? I guess I always associated like screw tops with maybe like less nice wine, but clearly that's not the case.
Yeah, I have a strong opinion about this. I mean, so there's screw tops and there's regular corks. There's now composite corks that are made from synthetic material. I personally love screw tops. I think that there's this there's misconception about screw tops, that they're cheap, like low quality wines that are, you know, that are inferior quality. And I think that's starting to change, but I am determined to make sure that does, because basically screw tops, the difference between a screw top and a cork is a screw top is anaerobic, right? So it's not going to allow, the reason why cork is useful for wines that are meant to age is because they allow just the slightest amount of oxygen in and out, right? Because corks are porous. And so when you're talking about a wine that is meant to age, you actually do want that very slightest bit of oxygenation to happen. And it allows the wine to develop. But when you're talking about wines that are meant to be consumed right away, like within a couple years, there's no real reason to have a cork in there. And it's interesting. I mean, that being said, I did a tasting at Sotheby's maybe a year or two ago with a producer in Australia. I think it's called Cloudburst. And they were marketing, they had these like super high-end Chardonnay that is a screw top. And I'm talking like over $100 price point. And I was really impressed by the quality, and it was a screw top. And I think it was bold because they're really trying to change, you know, they're marketing a luxury product, very high-end wine with a screw top. But I think more and more producers, especially in the New World. So when I say New World, I mean regions where vines didn't originate, where they were brought, like Australia, South Africa, Chile, etc. I think Australia, especially, and New Zealand, have done a good job of like pushing screw tops. But I think it's tough because, I don't know, I'd be curious to take a poll, you know, like what the perception is among screw tops right now. I think most people still associate screw tops with inferior quality wine, which is a mistake. I think there's amazing quality, like this one here is a screw top that I happen to pick, this Bedrock Otululu, and it's a fantastic wine. And quite frankly, having been in situations where I've had to open like 6 bottles at a time for an event or a party, it's pretty awesome when you can just like unscrew the wine. And it's no hassle. They travel well. You can reclose it. It's just a matter of like, do you need a cork? If I would want a cork if I was dealing with a wine that I was considering cellaring for an extended period of time. But for most of the wines that we all drink, we're not cellaring anyway, you know? So that's my 2 thoughts.
Yeah. Then another question about price. Why is wine so expensive in the US as compared to like European countries? People attribute that a lot to shipping, but didn't know if there was other reasons for that.
This is a much more complicated, long, complex topic than we probably have time for in this session. But well, part of the reason is because of the way that the regulatory structure that's in place here, which has been in place since Prohibition. In the US, we have a 3-tier structure. So a winery can't sell directly to a restaurant or a retail shop. Everything has to go through a distributor. So a winery or an importer, in the case of foreign wineries, have to sell through a wholesaler, and then the wholesaler sells to the retailer or restaurant. And so just economically, like that, you're at, the more layers you have, obviously the more expensive the wine is going to be. And that was kind of intended, right? I think after Prohibition, they wanted wine to be more expensive. They wanted wine to be more expensive because they wanted to discourage people from drinking. So it's pretty crazy. I remember when I was learning about the industry and I found out about the 3-tier system and just how wine laws or how wine is regulated, I was shocked because it's so archaic. It's pretty crazy how little things have changed with how much the industry itself has changed. And that's a really like hot topic now in the wine world. There's a lot of, especially now with COVID, there are a lot of laws that are kind of being reconsidered. Like, for example, right now, everyone can buy wine if you order food from a restaurant, you can now take wine home. That is like unprecedented, and so it's interesting to see how COVID is kind of changing that, and to see how that's going to change. But that's part of the reason why wine is more expensive, because of the system we have in place. There's more layers, and therefore it ends up, the more layers you have, it ends up adding more to the cost.
Yeah. Going back to the screw top versus cork, if you are lucky enough to have the space to store wine and it does have a cork, is there a recommendation for whether it should be horizontal or vertical, or does that matter?
Very good question. It matters very much. I remember when I was fresh out of college, didn't know anything about wine, but I started enjoying wine. I would always keep my wines in my kitchen. Worst place ever to store your wine. So if you have wine in your kitchen, remove it immediately. So a few tips about storing your wine at home. So first of all, you want to store it horizontally. And the reason that is because the idea is this cork is preventing oxygen from getting in, right? So, and that's what's protecting the wine. I mentioned before that some oxygen is good, but too much oxygen is bad. So what happens when you lay it horizontally, the liquid stays in contact with the cork and keeps it wet. If you for an extended period of time, leave your bottle upright like this, the cork will eventually start to dry out and shrink, and that allows oxygen in. So I would definitely not recommend storing your bottles for an extended period of time. I'm talking about many months, upright. I would always lay them horizontal. That's one. Two is make sure they're in a place, wine likes consistent cool temperatures. So that's why generally if you're in a house, the basement is always one of the best places to store your wine, because the temperatures don't fluctuate as much. So kitchen is the worst place because you're cooking, it gets hot, and then it cools down, and then it gets hot again and cools down. There's no fast track to spoiling your wine would be to keep it in the kitchen. I wish someone had told me that sooner because I stored my wine in the kitchen for a really long time. But yeah, and the other thing is light. You don't want light, so you want a dark place. So if you don't have a wine fridge, I would suggest storing it or a basement. I would suggest storing it in like the back of your closet where it's dark. There's no radiators or anything like that. So in the wintertime, the temperatures won't fluctuate as much. The thing is you want it laying horizontally, consistent temperatures, ideally cool temperatures, like between 45 and 55 degrees.
So if you do have a wine that's like a rosé or a white wine that you typically serve cold, do you store it, outside the fridge, or do you leave it in the fridge? What's the wisdom on that?
You mean for serving temperatures?
Yeah.
I think rosé, I personally, when I drink rosé, I like it just a little warmer than fridge temperature. So I would take it out of the fridge, like maybe 10 to 15 minutes or so before I was planning on serving it. That's kind of how I like to serve my rosé generally. You want it to be cold, but the thing is, if it's too cold, when a wine is really, really cold, it tends to mask a lot of the aromas and the character in the wine. So that's why with higher, especially a higher quality rosé, I would avoid drinking it too cold, because you're not going to be able to get all the nuances out of the wine otherwise. But listen, most of us are like popping rosé. We want to chill, have a good time, and not think about it. And I think just a bit lower than fridge temp would be ideal.
Cool. So a lot of folks, it seems, got the wines that you're actually drinking, and we're hoping to hear about the different selections.
Yes. So, so 3 different wines here. We'll start with this one here. It's Chateau Parasol is the producer. And for any history buffs out there, this particular wine has incredible history. I think the first vintage dates back to I want to say 1246. this particular region this vineyard where the wines are from was a resting stop for the Crusaders in the 13th century. So there's a very, very long history of winemaking here. And like I mentioned with Provence, this one's from Provence. I love the reason I think why Provence is so amazing for rosé is because it's warm, it's sunny, and so you get this ripeness and in the grapes. And why that matters, by the way, for the wine itself, how that translates is when you're making wine in regions that are hot and sunny, you actually smell the notes in the wine smell more ripe. So like, for example, I'm just going to put like a common denominator out there that most people will probably understand, like Pinot Noir. Pinot Noir in a hot place like Napa is going to taste very different than Pinot Noir from a cooler place like Burgundy. But the difference is Pinot Noir tends to smell like cherries, but Pinot Noir in Burgundy is going to smell more like sour cherries, whereas Pinot Noir from Napa is probably going to smell more like cherry jam and like almost like a sweeter cherry. So tying it back to this wine, Provence is sunny and it's relatively warm. It's one of the sunniest regions in France. So the grapes get ripe and you get this beautiful fruit profile, but you still get this nice freshness because the proximity to the sea keeps it cool and allows the wine to retain acidity. So that's what I kind of really love about this wine is it really checks all the boxes for me. It's really refreshing, and it has like a really nice fruit profile to me. If you're tasting it, what did I write? I did some tasting notes on these. I said this one, if you're tasting it, I got a lot of really nice floral notes like fruit blossom, like orange blossom, citrus, like grapefruit, and I got a really distinct stone fruit profile, so peaches and apricots. But yeah, like I think bottom line why I picked this is one of the wines that I picked is it checks all the boxes for me. It's giving, it has fruit, but it's still refreshing at the same time. And it's like not too weighty. For me, that's what I look for in wines with balance, you know, that like they're giving, but they're still delicate and they have freshness, which I think this wine does. But yeah, Parasol is a good one to know. It's one of my rosé go-tos for the summer. I shouldn't say this because I picked these 3 wines and I like them all, but I think this probably is my favorite of the bunch. I really, really love this wine. So that's on wine number 1.
Can I ask one question? Alyssa, I've unmuted you. I don't want to butcher this name, but she's trying a different.
Oh, okay. Hi. I just grabbed this Parasol. I love it.
Right.
I have the Cuvée de la Commanderie. Do you know anything about the difference between that one? I didn't know there was one.
These are the oldest vines. So the difference is these are from the oldest vines on the vineyard. So the reason why, and by the way, Alyssa, you should introduce yourself because hopefully Alyssa will be a future.
Yaz and I are both in the wine industry, so we met at a Middlebury panel. It's awesome. Not that many of us, but like a tight knit, and I see Sarah Bray on here too. So it's fun.
So Alyssa brings up a great like segue into a point I'd love to teach you about, which is that so this particular wine, they make different wines within the line. So the difference between the Commanderie, which she's drinking, and this one's made from the oldest vines on their vineyard site. So the reason why old vines matter, like who cares? Old vines, there's controversy about whether old vines are better or not. But the idea is, I like to liken them to people. Vines, as they age, over time, they become less and less productive. They're yielding less. But the grapes they're producing are smaller, more concentrated, wiser, if you will, over time. And so that's one reason is you end up with smaller grapes that are more concentrated. The roots also, the older the vine is, have time to dig deeper and deeper into the ground. And so they're more self-sufficient, especially in a really hot, dry climate. They're closer and closer to the water table, so they're more self-sustaining. But also, if you think about the roots, they're going down deep. They go through many layers of soil. So this goes back to the idea of terroir, where like if they're going through more and more different layers of soils and different soil types, the idea is it adds a sense of complexity to the wine. So generally it's more expensive older wine made from older vines because the yield is lower, so there's fewer grapes, and so there's less wine made from the same amount of vines. So it's more expensive because there's less yield, there's less wine, and it's also thought that it's more complex. And so, I mean, again, it's a very controversial topic that I'm kind of painting in broad strokes, but if you see, a lot of times you'll notice on the label, if it says old vines, or like in Germany, they call it Alte Reben, it's referring to old vines. They tend to be a bit more expensive and they're more premium wines.
Great.
I don't know. Yeah.
And while you discuss the other wines, a bunch of people were asking about food pairings with rosé.
Yes, food pairings with rosé are the best. Rosé is so versatile. And I think part of the reason why rosé is so popular in the summer, aside from the fact that it's just refreshing and wonderful and appropriate for all times, in my opinion, is that it goes with everything. And for me, when I think about food pairings for rosé, it's like, what would you eat on the patio or like at a summer barbecue? It goes really well with like grilled vegetables, pasta salads, kind of like any kind of light, fresh salad. And it goes with a lot of different things. But when I try and think about on a more granular level within the rosé categories, or just wine pairing in general, I like to think about how bold the flavors are. So if you're talking about a dish that's more delicate and light, like maybe like a crudo dish or a raw seafood or something more delicate and light, I would stick to a more delicate and light wine. So maybe like, for example, the Sancerre, this is a good segue into the Sancerre. This Sancerre is a rosé made from the region of Sancerre, which is in the Loire Valley in more northern France. So the main difference here between Provence and Sancerre is that in Sancerre, you're gonna get, it's further up north and it's cooler. So the wines tend to have more acidity. They tend to be like brighter, zippier, more angular, fresh. And this one's made from Pinot Noir. So in terms of pairing, I would pair something like seafood, oysters, something lighter, fresher with a rosé that's a bit zippier and lighter and fresher. If you're thinking on the opposite end of the spectrum of a bolder dish, like maybe like paella or something with like saffron and anchovies or olives, like garlic, strong flavors like that, then I would consider maybe pairing it with a rosé that is a little bigger and bolder, like a rosé from Rioja or Navarro, or and made from a grape that's a bit more robust, maybe. So when I think about food and wine pairings, the first thing I like to think about is kind of the intensity of the dish, because you don't want the wine to be overpowered by the food, and vice versa. So I would always think about it that way, like how big, bold is the food, and you want to kind of keep it even with the wine. Yeah.
As we go through the other wines, folks are wondering if there's a preferred glassware to enjoy rosé.
I'm a snob. Well, I guess I'm talking about brands. That's not what you were asking about. Glassware for rosé. I mean, I use a universal glass. That's what I'm using right now. I was shocked. I think glassware is one of those things that I was really skeptical about. About like the nuances and whether it's a big bowl or generally speaking, wines that are more aromatic and delicate, you want to have them in a bigger burgundy type bowl, like so, like this, because the idea is like there's more surface area exposed to oxygen, which gets the aromas going, and it kind of focuses the aroma. So something more delicate, you want a bigger bowl like this, something more aromatic. But with these wines, I would just a universal glass, I would say, for rosé. But with that, I feel like I'm going to continue on, just quickly talk about the other two wines, and then we'll get to the next. Thanks, Sarah, on the Zaldos wedding gift. So Sancerre. So the difference between Provence and Sancerre. Sancerre, we're talking about cooler region, further north. So the wines, if you're the type of person who likes white Sancerre, I would encourage you 100% to try the rosés. Most people don't even know they make rosé and Sancerre. Sancerre is made from Sauvignon Blanc, the white Sancerre that we all think about. The rosé is made from Pinot Noir. Bright, fresh, zippy, higher acidity than Provence. And this particular wine, actually, I should give a shout out to it. So Sotheby's, we put out this own label collection. So basically, this is one of the 13 bottles that we have in our own label collection. This is a Sotheby's Sancerre, where we basically partnered with a number of producers that we really believe in and love to create a line of wines that are all really perfect classic expressions of their region. And I find it to be great for people, especially who are just kind of like getting to know wine, because they are really great examples of what each of that should be. So if you want to know what a Sancerre is, we have a white Sancerre and it's a really great classic expression, or a Chablis. So I find them to be great. They're kind of like, if you think about it, they're like our stamp of approval, if you will, about like, I want a Sancerre, I don't want to think about it, just give me a good Sancerre. That's kind of, this is a great example in the label question. So this is part of that. The third wine here is called Ode to Lulu from Bedrock. So this wine has been all the craze lately. It's gotten a huge following. It's an interesting story. So the producer, he is actually the son of, if anyone knows Ravenswood in Napa. So this producer, he's been like making wine since he was 5 years old. But his whole shtick is he's rejuvenating and rescuing old ancient vines that were planted by the pioneers in California. So back to this whole conversation about old vines and why they're better. A lot of people are pulling out old vines because they're not as productive, because they want to plant something else. And so he's really spearheaded an initiative to resuscitate, if you will, old vines. So this one, and it's called Ode to Lulu. I love that. So before I go on to the Lulu part, which takes me on to my bonus wine number 4, we're now with the third wine. We're in the New World. So that's another important distinction. If I've lost anyone in the like little the minutia of some of the stuff I've gone into, if I can leave you with any kind of takeaway, Old World, New World. So these first 2 wines were from France, Old World, where vines originated. So France, Spain, Germany, Italy, Old World. New World, California. Aside from just like geographic delimitations, the difference between Old World and New World is deeper than that. It's also, one important thing is, like, I'm generalizing here, there's exceptions, but in the Old World in Europe, wines tend to have higher acidity. It's a little less sunny. Whereas in the New World, you tend to get warmer, sunnier climates, so the acidity tends to be lower. And the fruit, remember what I was saying before about Old World, New World in terms of the type of fruit? The fruit tends to smell more ripe. So they tend to be more fruit forward in addition to being lower in acidity. So if you like really fruity, big, bold wines, I would encourage you, there's a good likelihood that you probably like wines from warmer, sunnier places, like in the New World. Napa is a great example. If you like earthier wines, more mineral-driven wines with higher acidity, you'll probably like wines from the Old World more. And I'm like, it's kind of not just how much I'm painting with such broad strokes. There's so many exceptions. There's places in the Old World that taste more like the New World because they're warmer. There's places in the New World like this. This is a great example. This is in the New World. It's in California, but it's actually, I think, a more Old World example. Because if you taste this wine, you definitely get a ripeness in fruit, but it's still really beautifully fresh and balanced. And it has really nice structure and acidity. So it is more fruit forward to me, but it's still balanced. So that's why I love this one, is it's got that New World fruit profile, whereas this tends to be maybe a little more mineral driven, but it's still really fresh. I realize that must be slightly frustrating if you have it tasting in front of you, but I would, Sarah just asked, someone just asked about structure. And by structure, yeah, I feel like structure is a difficult concept to kind of relay, but it's the way that it feels in your mouth. And like, I like to think of it as like the backbone in the wine. Like how much does it have a skeleton that's holding it all together as opposed to just like falling apart in your mouth. That's how I kind of like to think about structure. And again, like a lot of wine tasting, like you don't just like roll out of bed one day with all these big words and like, oh, I smell like almond skins, you know. It's just a muscle that you kind of over time, the more that you actively think about what you're smelling and develop this vocabulary, it's like a muscle that you build. So if you have an interest in wine, I would encourage you, just like every time that you're drinking, like most people don't really take a moment to smell, you know, like just take in the moment for 10 seconds and think actively about what you're smelling and like what you're feeling. Is it more flabby? Does it kind of like fall apart in your mouth, or does it have verve? Is it sprightly? You know, like these are little things to try and notice in a wine. So it's kind of a long-winded answer to structure, but that's kind of how I like to think about it. And so this particular wine is called Ode to Lulu. And so the Lulu they're referring to is the very famous Lulu Peyraud, and she is the badass female of this winery, de Ventempierre, which was not in your little, we didn't have it at Sotheby's at the time that I sent this email out. We just got this in. And this really is kind of like the standard bearer, I would say, in the world of rosé. This is truly like one of the most lauded, well-respected wineries in the world of rosé that's making really age-worthy examples. I was ahead of this tasting, I was listening to a podcast by someone in the wine industry, Levi Dalton, and he interviewed the winemaker there. And he was saying that he tasted examples of this from the 70s relatively recently that were, wow. I have not had the chance to taste anything, and I think the problem is most people buy this and they drink it right away because it's so delicious that no one's like actually cellaring this. But it's kind of like, I'm curious. I feel like I should just put away one case to taste later. But yeah, they're really, this apple, the region specifically in France that this is from is called Bandol, and they really were responsible for kind of putting it on the map in terms of quality. And I would say like they don't have this Grand Cru system in Provence, but if there were, this would be certainly a Grand Cru in Provence, de Ventempierre. Super special. I feel like I haven't given it my full attention yet. I will after, but I don't know. That's kind of a brief. It's tough when we're not in person and you're not getting to like taste them with me. Hopefully, at least you got to taste one of them. But are there any other questions?
Yes. Some folks have asked how long after you open a rosé will it last?
Depends. I don't know. People have different tolerances for like how oxidized a wine is, because that's what happens to the wine after you leave it open. I personally think sometimes certain wines the next day I think can taste even better, depending on kind of, I think there's a few technical elements that go into it, but certain wines, I think certainly the next day, I think 2, 3, 4 days, you're starting to get a little. And it also depends on if you're like if you have one of those, if you have the, what do you call them? The air, like they take the air out, so they're not doing a very good job.
I know what you're talking about.
Proper thing, not a Coravin. Thank you, Melissa. Vacuum. Yes, thank you. That will help preserve the wine longer. I used a Coravin. It's like a little, here, I'll show you. This is like super schmance. And it's helpful when you don't want to open a whole bottle. And so like, that's what I did with these. You can tell this is half empty, but the cork, see how it's still on there. So this will help preserve the wine for longer. If you want to invest in one of these, if you're like, want to drink a nice bottle of wine and it's a Wednesday, you don't want to open the whole thing. This will help. It's not going to there's controversy about how long it'll truly last, even with the Coravin, but certainly several weeks with this thing. But yeah, I'd say like next day, 2 days, 3 days should be still.
And then similar to the aging question, they asked how long should you age a rosé?
Totally depends on the rosé. I think generally speaking, most rosés are meant to be consumed like upon release within 6 months to a year. I think there are a few examples that would benefit from aging. And the reason why I say they're meant to be drank soon is because like what makes rosé so delicious is that it has that fruit and that it's refreshing, right? As the wine ages, it tends to, well, it takes on more complex tertiary aromas. And what I mean by that is, like, I'll give an example with something I'm more familiar with aged examples, but like Burgundy, red Burgundy, for example. Burgundy is a region, the grape is Pinot Noir. As it ages, at the very beginning, it's more fruit forward. It smells like fresh cherries, strawberries, raspberries, and it tends to be more fruit focused. Over time, it develops these tertiary notes that are more complex of like mushrooms, truffles, like a lot of things that we associate with red wine with age are like leather, tobacco, cedar. These are all things that develop with age. Whereas what makes rosé so delicious is that really nice fresh fruit. And so that's why I wouldn't suggest generally aging rosé, with the exception of like these few wines that are made in such a way, in a style that is meant to age.
What about between tasting different kinds of rosé? Would you recommend switching the glass? Does it really matter?
Oh, you mean like in the same glass? I mean, we're talking like what level of wine snob do we want to go? I mean, if I'm at a taste, first of all, when you're tasting, it's actually always it's worse to put water in your glass than it is to just dump it and pour if I'm drinking red wine and I'm switching to white, I would put a little bit of white in it and swish it and dump it and not water. So I don't know. I mean, if we're talking, how many of you honestly are like drinking rosé in like a situation where you're, most of the time it's fine to like drink it, finish it as much as you can, and then pour the next one. Or if you pour it in another glass, if you like really want to enjoy them side by side.
Yeah. So I guess I'll end with one more question. Do you have other wine bar recommendations for those of us tuning in the New York City area?
Oh, Danny, another Southern. Yeah, so many. I mean, Aldesam is probably my number one favorite. I love this wine bar that's right near me in Brooklyn called Lalu, that opened not too long before all this COVID stuff happened. They're actually also doing really great online virtual tastings, and they're in what neighborhood is it in? It's on Vanderbilt in Brooklyn. I love them. Terroir in Tribeca is one of my favorites. Thank you, Prospect Heights. Amphora was my go-to. I think they closed Amphora. 10 Bells is like, if you want something a little more off the beaten path wines, a little more geeky. 10 Bells in the East Village is great. Yeah, those are a few that I love.
And we'll send a follow-up to this event to include like the recommendations of wines that Yassi has mentioned, and also these fabulous wine bars that she's talked about. And as well, like, we'd love to hear feedback about the format of this event. Like I said, it's the first edition of Wine School, but we're hoping to do more. So if there's interest, we'd love to know that. If you like the format, that's helpful too. But Yassi, why don't you wrap it up if there are like major take homes that you want us to go away with after our session of Rosé?
Major takeaways are, rosé. It's made from macerating the grape juice for a shorter period of time, just like a tea bag. The less you steep it, the lighter it'll be. And New World, Old World, we're talking Old World Europe, generally higher acidity, more earthy, mineral-driven wines. Whereas in the New World, like California, you're talking about more fruit-forward wines with slightly lower acidity. And fruit pairing, go match bold with bold, match lighter with lighter. I'd say those were kind of like the big pearls. But honestly, if you have any questions, feel free to use me as a resource. If there's anything you were afraid to ask, my handle on Instagram is eatdrinkyas, YAS.
Yeah, we also dropped that in the chat, but we can include it in the follow-up email as well. We really appreciate everyone tuning in. This has been so fun. And thank Yassi again for her time. We very much appreciate it, and I hope to see all of you at future editions of Middlebury Wine School.
One last thing, this is being recorded, and we're gonna be posting it. It's just gonna take a couple days, so there will be a recording of this available if you ever want to go back to it. If you loved hearing my voice so much.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone. I hope people have a good night.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Thursday. Thursday.